Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and welcome to Everything Co-op. This morning, we are celebrating an inductee into the 2024 Cooperative Hall of Fame, Dr. Christina Clamp. Good morning, Chris. May I call you Christina?
You call me Chris.
Okay, Chris. Good. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you. And it's great to be here.
Thank you for taking time out to be with us this morning. What part of the world are you in?
I'm actually based in Boston, where I've lived since I went to graduate school. I grew up on Long Island, New York, first in Hicksville and then later in Central Islip, New York.
Hicksville sounds like where I grew up in West Virginia. Hicksville, okay. Hicksville, New York.
Yeah, it was a small town, volunteer fire department. And my family would go to a Chinese restaurant on Monday after my dad got off the Long Island Railroad, where he commuted from a business that was family-owned engraving business in New York City. His dad was instrumental in developing commercial engraving for a business activity in the city that became his and his brother's and a cousin's business until the three of them passed away and it went out of the family.
Engraving. So Long Island, New York, and then Boston, and you've been living there a minute or so too. Then you say since your doctorate?
Yeah, I moved here in 1978 first for the master's and then the doctorate at Boston College. Although, Boston is still pretty provincial in the sense that people think if you weren't born here, you're still an outsider.
And are you still considered an outsider? Well,
I served 19 years on the board of the Community Development Corporation, so I think I overcame that barrier. When my younger daughter was looking for where to go to college, some of our elected officials came and asked me what she was interested in doing and whether they might be able to help.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you grew up in Long Island. Where'd you go to undergrad?
So my undergraduate education was with Friends World College, which is now the Global Studies program at Long Island University. It was a small program that was part of a group of experimental colleges that did field-based, design your own curriculum type of program. And it was started by the Long Island Quakers because post-World War II, they wanted to raise a generation of peace activists, social activists. And so that was how it appealed to me because I graduated high school right at the time of the Jackson State and Kent State killings of students on campus. And I really wanted to go someplace, and especially wanted to get out of the United States to develop what I would now call cultural intelligence in terms of the ways in which we as Americans have a lot to learn about the way things are in the rest of the world. And that led me to, first I worked with a civil rights organizer with Southern Regional Council doing field work in South Florida to recruit young people for a youth leadership training around student desegregation issues and push-outs of student activists. And then I went to India where I was studying with a Gandhian who was on the faculty of Friends World College and met with people who had been involved with Gandhi's struggle for independence and learned about Gandhian economics, which was fascinating for me because it was there I first learned about land trusts and about cooperatives. And then went to Central America.
I got to stop you a minute.
Yeah.
So you're telling me in undergrad,
Yeah.
so you're in the 70s, that you learned about Gandhi, land trusts, and co-ops in undergrad.
Yes.
You're one of very, very few. Chris, we've been on this air now October 11 years, and I would say maybe 2 people I've talked to in that time that have gotten, in their formal education, some knowledge of co-ops. I got none. Okay. With 2 master's degrees in the undergrad, I got nothing about co-ops. Okay. So you knew about Gandhi, land trusts, and co-ops in undergrad, and you went to India. Okay, fantastic. Tell me more.
Yeah. So when I came back from India, I was really questioning whether I was getting the right education, which is ironic given what you just said, and considered. I actually took a year to do coursework at University of Virginia as a non-matriculated student, and did that for credit at the Quaker college that I was enrolled at. And it was great because I had the chance to meet Alice Walker there when she came to the campus for an event, and I was doing a directed study with Paul Gaston on the history of the South and civil rights. And from there, I ended up going on to Central America, where I learned Spanish, studied first working on language skills, language acquisition in Guatemala, and then going to Costa Rica, where I worked with a sociologist and actually volunteered at a daycare center run by Christian Children's Fund as a way to strengthen my understanding of the culture, the people, learned about the demographic shift of people from rural areas to urban areas and what was driving that, and had a roommate, Robin Rosenbluth, who was very interested in cooperatives, and through Robin I began to recognize that there were cooperatives all over the place in Costa Rica. The Costa Rican government had a ministry of development that was promoting cooperatives. And there's a Quaker community in Costa Rica that's been there for decades called Monteverde. And so I actually went up to Monteverde and met with people in that community and learned about their dairy cooperative.
I'm just floored with the education you got compared to mine. Going to India, coming back and going to Guatemala and Costa Rica to get to Spanish. And I'm wanting to go to Costa Rica now, both to study Spanish and their history. I get excited about. They don't have an army. They spend a lot of money in education. Right. They have all of these co-ops. It seems like a fascinating place. I lived 5 years in Puerto Rico, and I did not learn the language. And I think it was partly because of Spanglish. They would use English and Spanish together and talk very fast, and it was very hard. So I think somewhere like Costa Rica, Mexico, where they spoke Spanish, might have been a better place to learn it.
Plus, it's spoken a little more slowly than it is in Puerto Rico.
Yes, that's speed.
Yeah.
Okay, so you learned about co-ops in college, and then later as you're doing this study in Costa Rica. Now, one of the Quakers have been very helpful to the black community doing
That's right.
The Underground Railroad, doing the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. They've just been fascinating when you talk about Quakers and really helping people that are down and out or humanity's trotting on them. So I've got a lot of respect for Quakers. Did you become a Quaker?
You know, I did. And it was an interesting journey in terms of thinking about my engagement with religion and spirituality. Back in around 1990, I got asked if I would work on a funded research, Pew Foundation funded research on faith-based community ministries in Hispanic communities. And because of that work, I started to re-engage with the question about the importance of faith and in community building. And I was doing work in New Orleans with the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and the vice president I was working with, she was married to a minister, and her assistant was a minister. And I remember a conversation with the two of them, because the gentleman who had persuaded me to get involved with something of a spiritual nature was a Baptist minister in Philadelphia who'd been my student, Reverend Louis Cortez, who heads up Nueva Esperanza CDC. And if you don't know Louis' work, it's just amazing what they've done in Philly with building an associate degree program. They have essentially developed a high school. They're just doing amazing stuff there in strengthening and building their community. And Louis was pressing me that instead of reading the Sunday paper on Sunday morning, I should find my way to church. And so I was talking with my two colleagues from New Orleans, and they said, you know, Chris, we've been thinking about this and praying on this, and we really think you should become a Quaker, because the Quakers have always been our friends in the Black community, and we think that spiritually that would be a good fit for you. Wow. Well, what can you say after that?
Wow. Yeah, Quakers have always been friends. And they're called friends. Good. Okay.
They are called friends. Yeah.
And they live up to that. That's neat. So what did you major in college?
Well, because I was making my own major, it was like, how do I define this in the end? And what I ended up doing, because I had spent, I guess it was 2 semesters in Central America, so a full year plus actually through a summer, and then came back to work on my capstone senior thesis paper, which was on the overthrow of a dictatorship in Guatemala, using oral history. I actually interviewed people who had been the student protesters, interviewed the man who had been Secretary of State in the Jorge Obico administration, and it just made sense for me to have a major that was Latin American studies.
Okay. When did sociology come into the picture?
Well, that's an interesting follow-on, because when you get to the end of the program of studies like I had, you look for an expert in the field who can be your external examiner. And I was so impressed with the work of a gentleman who was at Harvard running a center on civilian nonviolent peaceful resistance, and his name was Gene Sharp. He wrote prolific. He's now passed away, but I went and asked Gene if he would be my external examiner. He said yes. I drove up with someone from Friends World College in an old car that fortunately got me there and got me back, and had the interview with him. And at the end of the conversation, he said, "You have done a piece of work that is already at a graduate level. Have you thought about going to graduate school?" Well, my mother had not finished high school, and yet she saw the importance of education. And so I asked Gene what he was thinking, and he said, I know of someone at Boston College, and I think we could get you in there even though you're behind deadlines for applying. So we found a position for me at Boston College with the sociology department, and I ended up staying there for both a master's and a doctorate. And because of the ways in which I'd been influenced by my experience in Central America, I really wanted to focus on how can we change things in the United States. And from my studies, I was convinced that cooperatives were very important as a way to go about making those changes.
So what is sociology? What is that study of society?
Yeah, it was funny when I, late in my teaching career, ended up teaching in undergraduate students, and I would be tasked with teaching Introduction to Sociology. And my starting point was always to say that it's important to recognize that there's a field of anthropology which focuses on the study of culture, and then sociology can also look at culture as a part of a bigger lens of looking at people as individuals and groups, and how those groups then interact with each other. For me, sociology that most interested me was more at the macro level and the institutional level, because that's where you can get into a healthy discussion about the way that our economy is structured. And my focus in my graduate studies was on social economy and social policy.
Wow. Social economy. What is that? And how does that relate to co-ops?
So the social economy really delves into the ways in which we strengthen civil society, the ways in which we address the huge inequalities between those who have and those who have not. Just in terms of a snapshot on this, think about how disruptive the pandemic was for communities. And I did a piece of work that is now part of a United Nations encyclopedia of social economy. And one of the more fascinating case examples we came across was a non-governmental organization in India that recognized that with the disruption of the pandemic, parents were still having to work, but the children didn't have the structure of school. And so they created a structure that included not only place for children to go to continue their schooling, but to have activities through the weekend. So it wasn't just how do you deal with the disruptions, but also recognizing that the parents couldn't be there to care for the children on the weekends. And so I think with social economy, we're looking at what are the ways in which mainstream economics has gaps or failures, and what are the ways in which we can bring about meaningful change to make communities, make our lives better.
So one of the things I've learned by hosting a number of people on this show is co-ops come into play when there are these gaps.
Yes.
The one I think about, well, there's all kinds, but the rural electric co-ops.
Yes. That's a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you want to tell it why it's such a great example?
Well, it is a great example because if you rely on the market economy to bring the electric utility wiring to rural areas, it runs into trouble because the model doesn't work. If you're looking to do economic development with a profit motive, then the problem that you have with that is that in rural communities, you're not going to have enough people to underwrite and maintain the cost of those power lines. I think you can see this right now in Boston. We're dealing with the closure of 8 hospitals in the state because they were taken over by a for-profit Stewart hospital group, who then separated the land that the hospitals are on from the hospitals themselves. So you have Apollo Global Management that basically has created a model that's not sustainable for moderate and low-income communities. And I think it just illustrates the ways in which maybe the Clinton administration was correct when they were trying to think if there was a co-op model that could support the provision of health care. And of course, we have group health that has done that in some parts of the country.
Okay, so co-ops come in to bridge this gap when profit motive capitalistic model doesn't work. People could not make the money. In DC, it's Pepco. This large company could not come in, put up all of these lines from one house to the next, and there may be 5 miles in between them. Okay, and so they wouldn't put up all of these lines because they couldn't make enough profit. But the co-op model, when you take the profit out of it, then they could work.
Right. I think a good illustration of the failings of this is one that we've seen not too long ago in Puerto Rico, where the electrical, the provider of electricity on the island was taking the money out for profit and not reinvesting in upgrading the hardware that runs the system. And so with the hurricane, I think it was Maria, the system really crumbled, particularly in rural areas. And thanks to my good friend and colleague, Martin Lowry, when I asked him if he had some ways that the rural electrics could step in there, they did, to work with people on microgeneration and ways to ensure that people weren't going to be left in the dark.
Literally left in the dark.
Literally, yeah.
And Martin Lowry has talked about some of these big burly guys that put up the lines when they'll go to Central America to help, or somewhere in Africa or even Asia. He said they'd come back and talk about their experience with tears in their eyes because of the joy that people had when the lights came on. And we take it for granted here, for most of us, that there's electricity until there's some failure, like in Puerto Rico, or some storm or flood, and we lose electricity. Okay, so social economy, I find that exciting. I would have liked to have studied that. And you stumbled on it. Okay.
I did. I think I had a good guardian angel guiding me in those years.
So how long did you teach this work?
Oh, gosh. I started in 1981 at what was then New Hampshire College. It's now Southern New Hampshire University. And for 27 of those years, I was with a program in community economic development. And we were bringing in a class of graduate students, both from all over the United States and internationally. And I just felt really fortunate to be working with such an amazing group of people. And I ended up for a number of years in the later years being the director of the national program. And we were bringing in somewhere on the order of about 45 new students each fall, and which is pretty amazing for a graduate program. We later added a doctoral program, and some of my students you will recognize names of, like John Holtzclaw, who's with Rochdale Capital, and Noemi Dispense, who's with Keystone Cooperative Development in Pennsylvania. And I just can't say enough about, people will talk, and I still talk about a couple of the people that I studied with when I was at Friends World College. Julio Kwan, who's now retired in Tacoma, Washington, but who studied the Central American Peace Center in Costa Rica, or E.P. Menon in India. But I feel like I learned so much from the people who were my students, and feel so fortunate that I had a gig working with such great people and could add whatever little I could to help them make a difference in their communities. Because they would do a community development project as part of their requirements for the degree, and that would happen across the 2 years that they were in the program. And so we would work with them on skills around project management, and they would take what they were learning substantively in their classes and connect that to what they were trying to do in their communities. I recently reconnected with one of my former students, Elvira Sargent, who's with the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation, and her project had been to develop a school on the reservation. And I was in Bolivia, and one of our group leaders, this woman, Rebecca Cutler, got a phone call, and it was from Elvira. And lo and behold, she's done this great job of developing this school on the reservation that allows young people to sustain and enrich their understanding of their own culture and language. So
the Mohawk
those are the
Nation.
kinds of things that. Yes.
What country? State?
In upstate, in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is so interesting, because we often don't think of Native Americans in upstate New York or D.C. or anywhere. Think of them out in the Midwest.
Oh, they're here,
yeah.
And we need to recognize whose land we're on. One other thing in that regard is working on the various steps towards being inducted into the Cooperative Hall of Fame. I was amazed to hear about some of the other students who I had that, when people graduate, you don't always know what happened with those projects that they did. And lo and behold, there's a cooperative that was started by Somali refugees in Maine that Ali Guri was my student who worked on that, and that cooperative is now up and running. It's an agricultural cooperative. And there's another cooperative that got started in Cameroon by a gentleman who took my co-op course. I can't take credit for this, but I certainly am delighted that if there was an influence, that it made a difference for them and the people they were working with.
You can't take total credit, but
no.
Yeah, that's nice. And I've taught for 11 years, and when you see the light go on, I taught math and marketing. And when you see that light going on, that's the reward in teaching. And you see the light go on, and then they go out and do something with that knowledge they gain. Christina, We're going to take our first break. And for everybody out there, we've gotten a glimpse of Chris's past, Dr. Clamp's past. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we come back from the break. But I really want to spend more time with your futuristic ball, to tell us what you see happening in the co-op world in the future. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Co-op. Dr. Christina Clamp is our guest this morning. She lives in Boston, has taught for 42 years, has retired a bit, and she's been inducted into Co-op Hall of Fame this year. And we're being inducted together. We're in the same class. Okay.
Yes.
This is 11 years. We've been on the air. October, we celebrate 11 years. National Co-op Bank has been our main supporter those total 11 years. We were only going to do it for 1 month, the month of October, which is Co-op month. But everybody liked it, and I really am thrilled to talk co-ops with anybody I can because of all of the benefits. But NCB's mission is to support co-ops and their members by providing innovative financial solutions, particularly in low-income communities. And so they just make a great partner, a really great partner. So let's go back to, you were telling us of a couple examples. The Somali refugees in Maine created an agriculture co-op. There was a co-op created in Cameroon by one of your students. Do you have any other examples of co-ops that were created by the students that were blessed to walk through your doors?
Well, probably the first one that came to mind after those is there was an Egyptian gentleman, Ehab Zaglu, who developed a beekeepers cooperative. And you talk about the light going off in a class, and this gentleman suddenly is like, oh my God, this is perfect. We could do this beekeepers co-op with farmers in the Nile Valley, and this would be great. And he wrote to me after he went home and said that he had actually, the business plan that he did in my course worked like a charm in terms of making that co-op happen. So, and one other that I can think of was developed by, was a black student from Florida who saw that she could do a shared services cooperative with black business owners in North Florida. And then there was another student who was in Kissimmee, Florida, who likewise saw the value of doing a shared services cooperative with daycare providers so that they could lower their costs of purchasing supplies and manage their costs so that it would continue to be affordable for families.
So what is a shared services cooperative?
Oh, I just got asked that the other day by Matt Epperson from the Georgia Cooperative Development Center, because they are hoping to do more with shared services. Simply put, if you think about ag co-ops, they typically are focused on aggregating their harvest to get better pricing and to lower their costs on purchasing the supplies that they need for their farms. So shared services is really the way that I refer to this segment of the co-op community more broadly, in terms of individuals and organizations that come together to be able to lower their operating costs. So, for example, with two colleagues, Carol Corin and Eklu Amendo, we did a book on shared services cooperatives, and we found there are lots of great examples of this model across all sectors. Anyone who's listening who's a member of a credit union may be familiar with the credit union service organizations, and the CUSOs, as they refer to, enable credit unions to serve their members by sharing with branches so that, for example, my brother-in-law, who was living for a time in Athens, Ohio, and then moved to the Northwest, was able to maintain that account and do his banking up in the Northwest because of the branching. And the other area that I've seen is for there's a group called the Back Office Cooperative based out of Chicago, and they enable nonprofits to be able to come together and jointly negotiate for services like janitorial services or snow removal, but also they can use it for back office accounting operations. School districts will often do this for programming that they don't have a lot of students to support it. So, for example, vocational education, or it might be around special needs services. So it's a model that is out there in probably every community, but people don't necessarily see it as a cooperative. And yet, I think in some ways it's our low-hanging fruit in the cooperative community because it's an easier one to put together. And it really depends on having trust and having a shared need and making sure that you are able to do this without having free riders. Sounds a lot like what's needed in other cooperatives, too.
Well, that trust comes up all the time.
Yeah.
The trust is sort of the glue that helps the co-op to survive and strive. But the shared co-op, shared services co-op, when you first started talking, it sounds like that's for farmers. That's the marketing, what I call a marketing cooperative or a producer cooperative. Cabot Creamery would be one.
Sure.
Ocean Spray.
Yeah.
Cabot Creamery, the 600 or so cow farmers send their milk to Cabot, and they know they have a place to sell their product and they have a good price. And Cabot will, when you call it producer, they'll make cheese and cream cheese and yogurt and different things out of the milk. And on the other side is a purchasing co-op, shared services. Farmers use that. But there's one in D.C. called CPA, Cooperative Purchasing Alliance, and they were created for schools, charter schools, and churches. For all of those services, janitorial, snow, but also buying utilities, copier machines, they went out to vendors and created contracts and pricing that benefited these institutions. And what was interesting to me, that a lot of times the churches were managed by lay people that didn't have the skill sets. And so like trash removal, they may be paying 3 times what they could do when they got somebody to understand it and work for them. They could save a lot of money to do the kinds of things that they are in the business of doing, that's helping people. So yeah, this purchasing, this shared services, I like a lot. I never thought about it as low-hanging fruit that you can put them together better. That's interesting. Oh, any other examples? It sounds like when I taught marketing, it was experiential, that get somebody to do a marketing plan for a current business or create their own business. And it sounds like that's what you're doing, and that's when I found the knowledge comes alive, when they can use it.
Yeah, well, I've served for a long time on some co-op boards. Probably the longest one was the ICA group, which is based in Western Massachusetts now, and got started when I was in grad school out of the American Friends Service Committee offices here in Cambridge, Mass. And they do consulting for startups of worker cooperatives and for democratic ESOPs. So when you think about what it takes to start a cooperative, you've got to find the right legal information for incorporation. You've got to have people who understand how to put the co-op financials together. Are you going to have indivisible reserves, for example? We have a wonderful coffee co-op here in Massachusetts, Equal Exchange. And I part of what I loved about them when I was involved with doing some research and technical assistance for them around their expansion a number of years ago, I pulled some of my doctoral students in, and in going through some of their documents, which Clark Arrington, who also was inducted into the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, Clark shared with me the legal documents. Well, if Equal Exchange were to fail as a business, the residuals go back to the farmers who provided the coffee and the chocolate. And, it's a model that works against demutualization, which was a big issue when I first got involved with the National Cooperative Business Association. So I really like the way that groups like Equal Exchange have thought about preserving what's really beautiful about them as a business, as an organization.
I like Equal Exchange. They've been on the air. Clark, when he got inducted in the Hall of Fame, was on. And the thing that I found interesting was he created a way, because he had time on Wall Street, to take in preferred shares, non-voting, so that the co-op could maintain, I think it's the fourth principle, that they had continue to have in control, even though people put in the capital. The capital didn't control, the labor controlled the business. One member, one vote kind of thing. So yeah. But when you said a coffee co-op, I went, well, no, it's coffee, it's chocolate, it's teas. I like their teas.
That's right.
Bananas.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things. And I like their fair trade principles, that making sure that the farmers get a good price and they know what the price is for their product. It's fascinating.
Yes. Yeah, they're a wonderful company. So I used to take students on a field trip when I taught my co-op course, and we would start the day going to Equal Exchange, and then we would meet with folks at the ICA group and hear about the projects they were currently working on, and usually would then identify another group in the Boston area. It might be a housing co-op, and have the students learn about the different co-op models. And students loved it. And for me, it was great because it was a way to stay abreast of what my friends in the co-op community were doing.
Now, what is the ICA group? Because when I think of ICA, it's International Cooperative Alliance. So what is the ICA group?
So the ICA group started out as the Industrial Cooperative Association. And it was started out of the American Friends Service Committee offices at a time when manufacturing was leaving New England in droves. I think in 1 year we saw the loss of 36,000 jobs.
Wow.
In the state of Massachusetts. We used to have industrial manufacturing in the form of machine tools all up and down the Connecticut River Valley. We actually had a Ford assembly plant here. And so the real challenge that those of us who were paying attention was, how do we hold on to good manufacturing jobs? How do we make sure that people aren't going to be forced into poorly paid non-union jobs? And I think that's still a challenge for us.
And so the solution was ICA?
So the ICA group was created with the goal of identifying companies that were at risk of leaving, going under, and converting them to worker ownership. So just like the manufacturing renaissance folks are doing an early warning system to preserve manufacturing in Chicago now, that's part of what the ICA group was created to do, was to look for ways to work with the workers and the unions to preserve good manufacturing, well-paid union jobs.
You keep mentioning Chicago. I'm going next week to the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops meeting in Chicago. So it makes me want to have a field trip to some of these places you're talking about. Okay.
Oh, well, I can certainly do an introduction for you. Sequan Lawrence, who was my student, is in Chicago, and he is an affiliate of the Manufacturing Renaissance Group and does worker co-op development and workforce training for young people to get them involved with good paid jobs in Chicago that hopefully will be co-ops.
So what do you see are the benefits of co-op businesses?
Well, one of the benefits clearly is one that has to do with the fact that they have a place-based commitment. When you're in corporate America, people think not in terms of a commitment to place so much as a commitment to profit. And you go where you can maximize profit. And when we look at what happened to manufacturing in this country, a lot of good jobs went away because the managers saw opportunities to maximize the profit for shareholders and for themselves in terms of bonuses. And so, a good illustration of this is if you think about the economy of Maine, there was a lot of activity around manufacturing, such as Dexter Shoes, Bates Fabrics, which then Bates went south because of changes in labor laws in southern states where you didn't have to be accountable to a union. And then they, in turn, went overseas to places like Bangladesh, where they could continue to manufacture textiles, but didn't have to pay workers what workers should be paid. And they didn't have the regulation either about worker occupational safety. So
there's the benefits of co-ops is place-based commitment as opposed to profit. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I think that, when we think about what makes for a strong, vibrant democracy, when people experience democracy in their cooperatives, this translates into skills and expectations about how democracy should work in the community, in their state, in our government nationally.
Okay. So why then are co-ops good to fill in the gap when for-profit companies, we use rural electric as an example, but credit unions could be an example. There's housing. There's all kinds of examples that co-ops come in and fill in that gap. Why do co-ops fill that gap? What about co-ops make them fill it?
Yeah. So they fill that gap because they're not making their decision based on maximizing profit for outside shareholders. There's a good illustration of this that I came across recently with a group in Clarksdale, Mississippi. They lost their Kroger's grocery store. And there's a group there that is basically working with a local entrepreneur to expand that entrepreneur's operation to better serve the community now that Kroger's is left. To give you an illustration on co-op level, I got called a number of years ago by my old professor who I'd studied with in Guatemala, who now lives in Tacoma, Washington, and he said, Christinita, I need you to come to Tacoma. We need a cooperative because we don't have a grocery store in downtown Tacoma, because the way that the commercial grocery business works, they work from metrics, and when you're on the shore of Puget Sound, your metrics are never going to work well for downtown groceries. So I pulled Diane Gassaway in, and we met with a group in Tacoma to help them develop a food cooperative. And so I think that food cooperatives don't have to dance to the drum of corporate profits. They can dance to a drum that's about community and about serving the needs of the people in that community in a way that corporate America would be too quick to discount.
So I have another benefit I'd like to get your opinion on. So I think co-ops give people voice. And when they have voice, they have a say. When they have a say, they build up their own self-esteem. So co-ops are much more than creating wealth. They do create wealth for people, their members, whether it's a worker co-op or a consumer co-op or whatever type of co-ops. But it also really creates voice and self-worth and dignity. What do you think about that? You think that's true? Or?
I think that's true in some cooperatives, not as much as I would like in some others. And what comes to mind is that, you know, in housing cooperatives, I think there's a stronger expectation of us as neighbors to be engaged with the affairs of our co-op. In food cooperatives, I think that all too often it's a smaller subset of the membership that gets actively engaged. And I've heard this from people in food co-ops, such as Hanover Food Co-op years ago when I was working at the college, and I brought Harrison Drinkwater in to talk to my students. This was one of his concerns, was that all too often in food cooperatives, it's a small subset of the members that typically get engaged unless there's something controversial. And maybe that's okay as an expectation. When I went to do research on the cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, the Mondragon cooperatives, in 1982, I was looking for where one of the founders' offices was at the Ulgor cooperative, and I stopped a blue-collar worker when I was in the parking lot trying to figure out where I was going, and I asked him where I could find Jesus Larrañaga's office, and he said, "Who?" And I repeated myself, and he said, "I don't know, the main office is over," and he pointed it out to me, but he clearly didn't seem to know who the head of his cooperative was, which I thought was unusual. That said, I was impressed that in Mondragon, when I was there for the first time in 1982, I saw that people would run campaigns for office on the board, and that there was a vibrant democracy that was happening there. And this, at the time that shortly after the Franco dictatorship had ended. So when I think about democracy and cooperatives, that's one of the places that I see that democracy probably has played a very important role by strengthening people's experience and skills for democracy that they could then translate out into their community and into the national government.
So, Christina, what do you see for the future of co-ops in the U.S. and around the world?
Yeah, so I've been doing some work recently with Reimagine Appalachia, which is probably a group you're familiar with from where you grew up. And they had me involved with a colleague, Wendy Patton, from Kent State. We wrote up a white paper for them. And one of the things that we learned in pulling the data together for the white paper was that there is a strong wish to see more cooperatives in Appalachia, and that people want to do rebuilding the manufacturing base in the region, but they want it to be done in a way that it's not owned by outside owners. Cooperatives are a perfect model for this, and they want it to be union co-ops. And the reason they want that is because it was unions that gave them good jobs, well-paid jobs with benefits, and they want co-ops because the co-ops will be place-based rather than outside or foreign investors. So I think that's one area that I see a lot of opportunity, and I have a lot of hope. Another where I've had some conversations of late has been with a colleague from the Mondragon Cooperatives, Ivan Zugasti, and we have been talking with some other people about what's going to happen for Ukraine when the war is over. And Ukraine has had a strong co-op movement, so Co-op Ukraine. There's also Social Economy Ukraine, and we think that the co-op community can play a very strong role post-conflict there, just as co-ops have played a role in post-conflict Colombia. And Mondragon actually played a role in support of that work in Colombia, and I'm hopeful that Mondragon, by example, if not through consulting contracts, can play that role in other places. I'd love to see a role for co-ops in rebuilding in Gaza, for example, that would be done on a secular basis, but very much grounded in the needs and wishes of people locally. You know, all too often the discourse around Gaza has focused on Muslim terrorists versus Israeli government, but it's important to remember that there are also Christian communities both in the West Bank and in Gaza that have also been affected by the war and by the settlers who have been seizing property in the West Bank.
Yeah, it's a much bigger and complex issue in Gaza than we hear about it on the news a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm working with Michael Peck on a revised edition of our book, Humanity at Work and Life, and we are planning to have a chapter looking at post-conflict rebuilding and the role for cooperatives in that as a new chapter. We're also still working with the Own the Metrics campaign with our colleague Ichong Yi from UN RISD, or Research and Social Development Unit at the UN. I also think that the Work Act, which is being conducted through the Department of Labor, they have $50 million in new money to put into worker cooperatives in the United States through the employee ownership centers. And I'm hopeful that with support from Congress, if we could get more money and develop more centers for employee ownership around the country. These are being modeled on the Ohio Center for Employee Ownership that Chris Cooper is the director of, and the Vermont Center for Employee Ownership. But those represent an opportunity in conjunction with the money that is already handled through the USDA for rural development. I think there's some opportunities to do some interesting new development of cooperatives in the U.S.
So my last question to you is, what message would you like to leave people with?
I think my message to people is that if you're troubled by what you see happening with discourse in the United States that's partisan, let's look within our cooperatives for ways to take the lessons we've learned of working together in those settings to be active listeners and to work to create those opportunities for a healthier discourse and a healthier path forward for ourselves in the United States.
Healthier path forward in the United States through cooperation. That's it. That is wonderful. Thank you so very much, Dr. Clamp, Chris, and everybody out there. We'll be back next Thursday, and we would like for you to live cooperatively, work with each other.
Absolutely. And I'll see you in D.C. on October 3rd.
Yes. I'm looking forward to it. Excited. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
All right.
See you.
Take care now. Bye.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything